Dear Dad, I have spent over 10 years and $94,000 putting together my mosquito costume, and now I am pleased to announce that I have become a mosquito. The costume is quite realistic, and I even attached bladders to the nose thing so that I can suck up liquids when I puncture them, with my nose thing. I could be buzzing all around you on a hot summer day and you wouldn't even recognize me as your son child. You would just think, "Get away, mosquito." From my point of view, you would be 3,000 dads because of the way I designed the eyeballs. I might be saying, "Dad, it's me! Dad, it's me!" But you wouldn't be able to understand my language because of its buzzing. I'm also into plastics now and I'm making plastic tubes that you can suck liquids through. Kind of like my mosquito nose, but used for different reasons. Hope you're doing well at camp. See you soon. In the days of salad fingers, creepy, obscure at that time YouTube videos, not having the awareness and knowledge of the wider world, when I was younger, the greater expanse beyond the internet was shrouded in mystery, where horror from the web was mostly something left to the imagination, especially as a kid back then. I literally thought that the channel 666 was actually haunted, and a hand would grab me from the computer. I was so scared that I only opened the channel on YouTube in a public area, in an internet cafe near school, and was flabbergasted when nothing happened. From the plethora of creepypastas, SCPs, and internet myths, among the many art created, from video, audio, text, and webcomics, there was one which I now remember with a resurfaced interest, a webcomic titled Armless by Amalok1. Back in the day, I was very much a creepypasta fanatic. During the weekends where I'd be doing my digital painting or drawing, there was almost no mistaking I was listening to hours upon hours of creepypasta audio on YouTube. From the aptly named Mr. Creepypasta, Creeps McPasta, Mr. Creeps. Yes, their channel names weren't very sophisticated, but nonetheless, in those long drawn out moments of drawing and painting, I immersed myself in what is only analogous to internet campfire stories. From the fun but cringy classics like Jeff the Killer, video game horror like JVK1166Z.ESP, which was actually a Morrowind creepypasta, a game I would come to know years later, an interactive story with at least at the time a tangible website like Funnymouth which genuinely scared me, or something akin to mass hysteria and mythology like the Slender Man. When I was not passively listening to stories while drawing and painting, I would be either reading them at creepypasta websites on my phone, or, late at night, watch videos on the other side of YouTube. Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, Salad Fingers, Obey the Walrus, Sitting and Smiling, I Feel Fantastic. Yeah, at times it was fun creepy to downright I can't sleep now. As a kid, I didn't know any better. The intrigue of them, especially the more convincing clips being true or not, enticed me. But it was the creepypasta fandom, I guess, at that time that first introduced me to webcomics. As before that, I never really bothered with the medium, the closest being watching dubs on YouTube about them. The creepypasta comics sort of fantasized all these characters, from their dreadful and eerie individual stories, now become like a crossover drama action series. Like there was this one creepypasta comic where the Slender Man was literally the dad of the group. It took away the seriousness of it, but it was fun nonetheless. From those creepypasta comics, along with those uncanny YouTube videos, I came across a comic dub of a one Armless Amy. The webcomic was surprisingly not as popular as I thought it would be compared to the likes of Salad Fingers, which gave it, what I at least felt at that time, a sense of discovering something obscure, which added to the mystery of the experience. The comic dub was chapter 1 of the comic. It featured this simple drawn girl with no arms, like a child's first few drawings, along with her cat drawn in the same style, wandering a wasteland of a world. Again, very akin to Salad Fingers, but instead of a doubtful loneliness with an unreliable narrator, There was definite evidence that she and her cat were not alone, as a new character would reveal itself in that very chapter, the exact opposite of the protagonist. He was titanic, detailed, and most evidently, grotesque, a monster in the guise of a man. The contrast was uncomfortable and added to the atmosphere of the world, contributing to a gloomy and dreamlike feeling it instilled to me as a reader. An escape to a strange and ominous world, one might consider. Then, this monster would lure Amy to his dollhouse. Intimidation and threats would ensue, but in the end, it is revealed that this armless girl is not so innocent nor helpless as she may seem. The story would continue with more exploration regarding the wasteland. Just the emptiness and ominous presence of something lurking in the background just hits the sweet creepypasta spot for me. Eventually, we would meet new characters like Eustace, Eloise, Peter, and a bunch of other nightmare-fueled abominations that would keep you up at night. There is an overarching story to this. As I have reread it recently, the introduction of characters that compounded throughout the chapters are strung along into this sort of prophecy of an apocalyptic world. Now, I won't spoil the story for anyone, hence I would encourage you to please read it at your leisure if you have not done so. But going back, the webcomic, as you can see, has an ominous childlike style to it. Again, very much like Salad Fingers, a crude and simply drawn character often contrasted with detailed and grotesque encounters. Whether the style is due to intention or inexperience, at this point it doesn't really matter, as the way it was drawn and rendered completed the comic in all its glory. It is also duly noted that some pages or chapters were drawn by other guest artists. So in some chapters, especially when you notice radical changes in style, it is mostly due to another artist drawing them. In addition, there are panels where the background is an imported picture run through a filter. I would happen to know this because I did that too in some of my art back then. But still, again, the act of doing this elevated the comic rather than hinder it, as it added to the creepiness factor to it. If I were to describe Armless Amy as a webcomic, it's like an encapsulation of the creepypasta era, which, if I can recall from my experience, peaked around the 2010s until one day they just fell out of favor, I suppose. Because looking back, especially post-2020, creepypastas have been on decline, or at least I think so. I notice nowadays that I usually either listen to music or nothing when I draw or paint. Be that as it may, these internet horrors still thrive, but not as they used to be. Armless Amy to me though, back when I was reading it around 2014-2015, wasn't yet a completed comic at that time. I only returned to it these past couple years to see that it did in fact finally have an ending, and reread it all the way through, and again just recently this past month. As an artist myself who wanted to tell their story, webcomics was eventually a medium that I favored over just writing a novel, as it relied mostly on visual design rather than a purely written work, which played to my strengths and allowed me a much better experience and process. Besides Armless Amy, there was Ava's Demon, Lackadaisy Cats, Plague Race, The Seer, and more. But out of those webcomics, even until now, only Armless Amy remains finished. Webcomics, especially like Plague Race and The Seer, ended abruptly with a last page somewhere in the middle of their story, that just never updated all these years. The Seer, for example, is of course one of those fanfic creepypasta webcomics, and as a kid I was amazed by the quality, style, but most especially the story, as it included creepypasta characters I knew or were famous at that time, and just one day the pages just stopped updating, and the story never concluded. As for Plague Race, this webcomic was like the most amazing thing as a kid. I found it while surfing 9gag and a banner ad for this webcomic came up, and when I clicked it, upon entering the comic website, I was greeted with this sketchy black and white art that introduced me, sucked me into this mysterious world along with these characters, that even until now, the webcomic, as it is, holds up with its story, style, and characters. But what's it been like? Almost a decade? This forgotten masterpiece was just abandoned, though the author did have their reasons and had a whole blog post about it, so at least there was closure in the reason as to why it didn't continue, but it just irked me a little bit that this story is never going to be finished. Will they ever escape? Who knows? No one will. And it's such a beautifully drawn piece of art that I will never know the end of it. It had amazing illustrations, an atmosphere I would never forget. It was a world that touched me, and it will remain like that forever, an unfinished work. Perhaps I'll make a video about that some other time. But in addition to that, the author did have very good reasons, and they are making a new comic at the moment. I think if I remember correctly, the author expressed that they never really intended Prey Grace to be that big. A bit disappointing, but at the same time understandable. And that's just life. Which brings me back to Armless Amy, and how it influenced a major part of my own comic making, in that it was one of the inspirations for me to finish something with a beginning and end. And it didn't have to be this masterpiece looking thingamajig, just a well-presented piece of art with a flowing story with a definite beginning and end. Because if I were to compare the quality of Armless Amy to Prey Grace, it wouldn't be fair. But one is forever unmoving, whereas the other has found peace. Not only was Armless Amy a nostalgic comic that I experienced and will remember significantly, but also something that contributed to the betterment of my art journey. The simplicity of this comic, the story, characters, etc. made me aware and careful of my own creations and comics. As when I tried to juggle multiple characters, it would end up in chaos, until eventually I got the hang of it, over time with practice. I will herald this webcomic as a symbol of its time and the other experiences I associate with it, the creepypastas and my old art. On one hand, it feels as though it's been multiple decades since that time, but in reality, it's only been barely a decade. Looking back at these experiences, I realized the things that paralleled my inability to finish stuff, perfectionism, comparing myself to other artists way beyond my league, and overall things that artistically hindered me. These influences, although masterful in their works, would often paralyze me into inaction. But something like Armless Amy, a passion project that never withered no matter what all this time, not as meticulously drawn like Prey Grace, rendered magnificently like Lackadaisy Cats, nor painterly like Ava's Demon, yet still Armless Amy persisted and actually finished. It was relatively less famous than the others, yet it didn't stop itself from properly ending. And I think that it impacted me in such a way that I had to refocus and straighten my goals, no longer getting lost or paralyzed in trying to perfectly imitate others, but to get the job done by my own volition and not let ego get in the way. And I think that's about it. Armless Amy, a webcomic I remember, and have just discovered that it had quite a lot of things to do with my art journey. And so yeah, I guess this was like a little self-reflection of mine once more. But that's, again, part of the journey, I guess. And so, that's everything for now, and more of my stuff will be down in the description below. And as of course, to end this, a friendly reminder to anyone that if you are pursuing something of grandeur, like art, a hobby, or passion project, with all your heart and soul, no matter what happens, no one will ever have the right to judge you for not having tried. So just do it anyways.